Good evening, colleagues and friends. Welcome to the second College of ODPs webinar. Tonight we're joined by Matthew Sykes, who has been one of the ODPs, or the first ODP, working in the Nightingale Hospitals, and Matt's going to share his experience with us. We were coming into this at a time when everything COVID related just seems to be going in the wrong direction at the moment, and we are definitely very much in the second wave. We've got further areas coming into tier 3 lockdown, and it looks like Nottingham may be announced shortly. And today, additional tier 2 lockdowns were announced for Stoke, Coventry and Slough. So it's timely that Matt's going to talk to us about his experience in the Nightingales and perhaps some of the things that are going around ITUs at the moment. This webinar is being recorded, so we will make it available to registered attendees later on online, so people can refer back to it. So as of today, as I was saying, the latest situation is there's 21,000 additional cases announced today. That number, I think most people recognise as relatively meaningless, in that it's predicated on the number of tests that have been completed. What's more relevant is an additional 1,058 people admitted to hospital with COVID disease and 189 additional deaths from COVID. So things aren't going how we would like them to. I'm going to introduce now Matt, who's going to tell you a bit about himself and his background as an ODP, and then how he got involved with the Nightingale. So Matt, welcome and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Bill, no problem. So obviously my name is Matt Sykes. I'm an ODP of background. I did my ODP training in 2002. I did the old MVQ level 3 course. I was quite lucky that I did that, and it was funded for a private hospital called Bupa Bushy. So I'm very thankful to them, as I wouldn't be here today. It was a nice course. It wasn't your standard course in the university base like they do now. I was very much on the job training, and I used to have to travel up to Northampton to a place called Impact Training Services, which was based on an agricultural farm, and we did all of our college tutoring out of there, and a lot of my placements were at NHS hospitals in Hertfordshire. So I was quite lucky that I got to experience private sector and part of the NHS part of my training. I was then quite lucky to stay there for 3 years post-qualification. I've been able to maintain all 3 disciplines of the ODP, so I can scrub, anaesthetics, I can work in recovery. So I've got quite a flexible skill base. I then joined the NHS. I went to West Herts in Watford, and I was there for about 10 months before I became a senior band 6 ODP. At that point, I carried on with my skills with scrubbing and anaesthetics. So I would do 3 months in rotation with one of my colleagues. So we would rotate into the trauma theatre in orthopaedics. So whilst I was doing anaesthetics, he'd be on the scrub side, and then every 3 months we would swap back. It was something I sort of introduced whilst I was there to try and maintain ODP skills, because I think ODP should try to maintain at least 2 disciplines. I'm sure some just do anaesthetics now, or some just do scrub. But I found it that I thought if I could keep interested and keep my skills up, it would be a much more varied job, and I wouldn't get stuck in one sort of situation. I was then lucky enough to progress into a band 7 job in 2011 as part of an investigation I did at West Herts due to some never events that had happened. The never events happened in maternity, so it was all about retained tampons and retained swabs during surgery. Back then in 2011, it was still quite common for midwives to be the scrub nurse in the maternity theatres. So part of that project was me to convert that to scrub nurses, which went very successfully. And then I was in that role as the band 7 for the obs and gynae unit for about 2.5 years. I was then approached by my director of nursing in about 2013. And she gave me the opportunity to go and do a secondment as a theatre manager over at the elective site part of West Herts in St Albans. which was a lovely family-orientated hospital. Lots of lovely people there, lots of different skill base, lots of different types of surgery, high turnover elective work. Theatre utilisation was the driver, and targets for patients. And then I was there up until 2016, where I was approached by my previous director of nursing from West Herts, had moved to the Royal Free, and they were building the first fully digital hospital in the UK, which is where I'm based now in Chase Farm. And I've been here for 2.5 years. I've helped to help set up the hospital to a level 6 HIMSS. So that's basically based on its digitalness. The highest number is 7, and ourselves and Adam Brooks are working towards that level 7 digital status. But we currently are very paperless. The only sort of paper we do is consent forms. And once we do get that second stage consent process sorted, we'll hopefully be totally paperless and actually reach that HIMSS level 7. How I got to the Nightingale, I think I was very lucky. My current chief executive, who is here, Natalie Forrest, at Chase Farm, was the chief operating officer at the Nightingale. My medical director, Alan McGlennan, who is also based here at Chase Farm, was the lead medical director for the Nightingale. So all come about from a phone call. Because I work on an elective operating site, there's no acute patients that come here, it's all elective. So obviously elective surgery stopped towards the end of March. I got a phone call on the Friday, which was the 27th of March, from Natalie and Alan to say, look, what are you doing next week? We're at the Nightingale. We need some help and support. Would I be interested? And I literally jumped at the chance. So that's where it started, really. It was a very brief phone call from some senior colleagues that I work with. And she basically said, just turn up on Monday, come to the XL, tell them you're with me. And that's where the whole Nightingale story started, really. So that's where it all started.
So when you first turned up at the Nightingale, Matt, what was there? I take it wasn't a Nightingale hospital at that point, was it? It was more of an XL.
Yeah, so it still very much looked like the XL, but the army had been in. I think they were there the week before, so they'd already started building the ward. So the plan was to build the 4,000 beds that were required, and it was split across both sides of the XL. So I don't know if anyone's been to the XL, but the XL is obviously a large conference centre with a large boulevard down the middle that has the restaurants and the food outlets, and then either side is the kilometre-long halls where the conferences take place. So what they did is they built the wards on both sides. So there was 2,000 beds on one side of the boulevard and 2,000 beds on the other side of the boulevard. The army were very quick, so the first 2,000 beds was up within 2 or 3 days. We had modified copied an ITU bay into one of the ward spaces. And what was lucky in those early stages is that we had the Gurkha regiment, who basically came in and did a lot of replication. And that was a massive help to all of the clinical staff that were there in the initial opening stage. So we were able to do things in one bay, and the Gurkhas would come and replicate, whether that was a catheter trolley or a crash trolley, or how the bed space was laid up, how the suction was going in. That was all done very regimented. I have to say that military are on point. Everything was planned, executed. Everything met the time scale. We were able to obviously open the Nightingale after 9 days from start to finish of building it. My first day when I arrived is I was introduced to many managers and experienced staff from various different NHS organisations. I was lucky to have a head of nursing called Natalie Gray, who supported me very well in the early stages of getting there, and not knowing anyone at all apart from the 2 people that I'd mentioned earlier who'd asked me to join. And it was very quickly sort of brought up about ODPs and the skills that the ODPs could offer. Obviously, when I started looking into staffing, we found out that Deloitte's, the finance company, were actually leading on how this was going to be set up. So they created the staffing model. The only thing about the staffing model that Deloitte did is that they didn't understand where ODPs sat and what they could do within an ITU setting. So I was very much there at the beginning, early stages, trying to explain to Deloitte, and then it was another company that came in. KPMG then came in after Deloitte, who then took over the staffing structure with the health roster team from Allocate. We were able to basically set up the roster and basically highlight the areas where ODPs would be needed. So obviously ODPs would be needed in the proning team. They'd be needed in the crash teams. They would also be needed in the transfer team. So obviously we had CT scanners and various bits of equipment there where we could have to transport ventilated patients to have their CT scans. So originally I was the only ODP that was scheduled. I was there having to put the message across about ODPs and the value that they would bring. And then literally within a couple of days, I was literally standing in the training centers where the trainees were coming in. So all the people that had signed up to work would get offered a training date, and they came to the Excel. It was upstairs in the training facilities, not more the conference center. It's where they have the sort of smaller meeting rooms that you can hire out for smaller sort of training sessions. And at the end of each training session, I would just attend and I would literally put my hand up and say, look, hi, my name is Matt Sykes. I'm the lead ODP. Are there any ODPs in the room? And that was the only way that we could try and recruit some ODPs. So following a couple of days, I was able to meet a chap called Gary Brayside, Mark Hansen, who had traveled down from Manchester to help support training. And we're all ODPs of background. And I was quite lucky that they were on the training faculty and they were able to, I was able to give them a message to say, look, when you're meeting the staff, please ask for ODPs. Like, this is an area that I've got massive concern that I don't think we'd have enough. And lucky enough that within a couple of days, I had some ex-military chaps that had come down that had obviously seen that I think they've been furloughed in their jobs. I think some of them did a bit of security work. Some of them helped on film sets. And once I met those chaps, so one of them was a chap called Jamie Jones and another chap called Tim Barrow. Now, in the early stages, it was just the three of us. And we were basically planning where the crash trolleys would be, how the ODPs would work, packing all the crash trolley bags together, everything that an ODP would do, transfer kit, understanding the Penlon ventilators. We had 50 Penlon ventilators that came, so we weren't generally using ITU ventilators at the Excel. The majority of the ventilators were the Penlon anesthetic machines. I think we had about 11 Draeger ventilators that came from the Wellington Hospital, but mainly the ODPs were the people that we needed to ensure that these anesthetic machines were going to keep these patients alive, making sure that we change in the circuits and any soda lime that was discussed. Do we put soda lime in? Do we not put soda lime in? Do we use humidification? Do we not use humidification? I think the whole process of having a ventilated patient in a field type hospital is very difficult to understand. And having the ODPs around to maybe support these anaesthetist doctors in an unfamiliar setting had to be done, to be honest. And then after about 4 or 5 days, we started to get a few more chaps in. There was a chap called Jack Price who came from the cardiac hospital. They're linked to the Brompton, Harefield, and I think they'd stopped doing their cardiac surgery, and he was able to come and join us. And then obviously my colleague Gary Brayside, who I eventually handed over the lead ODP role once I'd sort of slipped into ITU matron role, which was a massive support. But yes, at the beginning, getting the message across about ODPs was quite frustrating. And eventually, once we had got in and people could understand the direction that we wanted to go in, that they actually realized that they needed more ODPs. So then we were basically looking through every training schedule, finding ODPs, finding clinical scientists. They were the other sort of golden egg that came out of the Nightingale. So all of these people that sort of work in laboratories doing technical stuff with kit, they basically came in. You could give them an instruction manual to, say, an NIV ventilator, and they would go away, set it up, play with it, test it, and they basically did support the ODPs in any medical devices within the Nightingale Hospital. The structure of the staffing was very broad, I have to say. So obviously we had some ODPs, we had these clinical scientists that came. We had 1 ITU nurse per 6 patients. We had 2 registered nurses, but they were generally not from surgical or any sort of ITU background. These were nurses that had finished in their elective, I don't know, sexual health clinic or outpatients. These weren't people that had interaction with ventilated patients, not even A&E nurses. Like, this is, now they were great, because I have to say that everybody that came to the Nightingale came with the right attitude. Everybody came there to work. There was no one forced to work there. There was no one told they had to go there. Everyone came of their own free will. And I think that was, along with the staff and the learning model that we had alongside it, I think it was fantastic. Some of the HCA, nearly most of the HCAs we had were a few student nurses, but we had people from building sites, we had air hostesses, we had lots of furloughed staff that literally came forward. And as an ODP, it felt very enriching to understand that all these people had come voluntary to help, and all I needed to do was just to support these people in practice. But it was a testing time. It was.
It's very interesting the way you described the setup, that, because you're probably aware that ODPs tend to bridle an awful lot because they're either not considered for posts, or when they put themselves forward, there's a sorry, I don't understand, what are you sort of approach. And I think the theme, certainly the theme in the last presentation we had was around people just don't know. And it sounds like your approach was, yeah, fine, you don't know, let me help you understand and explain. And that is what's certainly paid off the dividends.
It was all about trust, to be honest. I think having the people above me that, one, they didn't know me. They didn't know me at all. Like, we'd met within 2 days, and they were actually listening and trusting the information that I was able to give them. And even just being that responsive, I thought was, it doesn't ever happen in the NHS. I don't know whether it was just this certain situation of the Nightingale and like everyone's attitude just to get on and do it. But it definitely made a big difference that they were able to listen and understand. And finally, after a few days of, we had military doctors that were also saying, look, where are the ODPs? So it was very much a group effort. And once we built that base of ODPs and we were able to show them what we were about, they definitely knew that we were one of the assets at the Nightingale, to be honest. Especially supporting some of the nurses that had never seen a ventilator before. Just being able to up that oxygen, just so you can do a closed suction on the patient. Just all those little minor details. Where the ODPs just came and supported it. It was fantastic. It was excellent.
I think it's sometimes difficult. We're sitting here now, where we are with a second wave building around us, to remember back then when you were starting. What was this? This was March, was it? March, April?
This was early April. So we opened, I think, on the 9th of April. So we were.
Yeah. Making it up as you go along, actually, with COVID. Everyone was.
Pretty much. One of the toughest things was procurement.
Yeah.
So the military ordered 4,000 of everything, which was probably an oversight or a bit of a, maybe they tried to order too much at once. So some of the orders that they put 4,000 orders through for, I don't know, eye gels, the company would then say, we can't supply that many in one go. So if we were to look at it again, the procurement side, I would definitely say you would probably do it in 250 batches. So let's base it on 250 patients at a time, and then we'll increase it as we go on, and not put so much demand on, because every area of the NHS would have been redeployed into respiratory wards, ITUs or physiotherapy rooms being converted into ITUs. I know that the majority of the London hospitals doubled their ITU capacity quite early on in the COVID stage of sort of late March, early April. And I think that's why we're going to be in good stead now in the future. But it just put a lot of demand. All those expansive areas, procurement was a problem. We barely got any closed suctions. We didn't get many tube holders at that point. We were just basically taking stuff from, we would retrieve the patients from the hospitals, and we would try and use their kit for as long as possible before we could actually get all of our own procurement kit organized. And I was quite lucky that I had a chap called Darren Woodall, who was an ITU nurse in the military, and I worked very closely with him on procurement, and we had to go through lists and lists of items to ensure that the staff and the ODPs had everything we needed, whether that was putting central lines in, changing the arterial lines, changing tubes. Obviously tubes were blocked quite regularly due to obviously the COVID in the lungs, and just being able to have that kit was yeah, but it was a bit of a struggle at the beginning, I have to say.
You mentioned very briefly how you were the lead ODP there, but then you mentioned briefly, well, you then became the ITU matron. Tell us a bit more about that, because you're not going to get away with glossing over that one.
So obviously we built the team of ODPs, and due to my background of being a theatre manager and managing 100 staff a day, my sort of head of nursing, Natalie Gray, sort of approached me and said, look, how do you feel about being a clinical matron, like a shift matron? So you're going to be on the unit for the long days, the 12 hours, the nights. And I was up for it. I wanted to help where I can. So whether that was in an ODP as a crash team or as a transfer team or doing the proning team, I was there to be involved. And to be honest, I was lucky enough to be offered that role, which I took on. I was very proud to be able to support those nurses and the teams involved in the Nightingale. And yeah, and that's how it went on really. And being a clinical matron, we obviously had to have huddles before. We tried to be positive with all the staff. We had a fantastic learning model. So there was one of my colleagues from the Royal Free, a chap called James Mountford, came and helped set up a learning system where we would have bedside learning coordinators on the shop floor. So as we're trying to train the builders or the air hostesses how to do the blood gases, we had lots of these bedside learning coordinators asking people, how do you feel? What can we do to make things better for you? What things do you need on this shop floor that can make sure you can care for those patients? And I have to say, with the staff attitude and the learning model that we had, it just made things just work. We were learning constantly. There's no way you can be in a field hospital, totally out of your comfort zone, and trying to understand how that works. So obviously there's a photo on the screen right now of the ward. There were 42 beds long. So to manage each side of the ward, we had one band 7 and myself. There was multiple ODPs as part of that group. The other stuff we did was obviously huddles before. So we would meet each individual team, whether that's proning, turning. You'd give them some instructions outside of the unit before you had your PPE on. And what came out of the learning module and the bedside learning coordinators is that we had 3 key messages. So 3 key messages were things like, please, when you do a blood gas, please show it to the ITU nurse. Don't just stick it to the chart and not act on it. So we had lots of these early messages, checking blood sugars. So initially within the first 2 days, we could only do blood sugars on the gas machines. There was no point of care devices in the ward, but when equipment came very quickly, we quickly got it into use. But every huddle we would have a top.
We've got you visually. Can we? Yeah, we can't hear you, but we can see you. Matt's just obviously struggling a bit with his sound. Yeah, we haven't got you on audio yet, Matt. See if you can fix that. Whilst we're waiting for Matt to get his audio back, I think there's a real lesson there in some of the, can't hear you, no. A real lesson there in some of the things that Matt was telling us about attitude and experience. And certainly if I go back to my early part of my career, I was once a team of, they weren't matrons then, they were nursing officers we used to have, but it was a team in surgical services, and I was the theatre manager, so I was counted as one of the nursing officers, albeit the theatre manager. And when the head of nursing services went on leave, and went on a secondment actually for just over a year, I ended up as the acting nursing services manager over a team of nursing officers, including A&E and all the surgical wards. And that came about because of the way I got on with people, my experience, knowledge, and belief. But a lot of it is attitudinal, and the fact that you're going to fit in with a team. I'm rabbiting a bit because Matt's obviously sort of rejoining us. We had a little technical glitch there. And I think that's a real lesson for today, that ODPs won't always get every opportunity that they want, but with the right attitude and approach, you can very quickly find yourself leading a team of even quite senior nurses as the ODP, and it doesn't really much matter. Matt, are you back with us for?
Can you hear me now again?
We've got you on audio. Thanks, Matt. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry about that technical hitch. Apologies. Where were we, Bill?
Yeah, you're talking about, I mean, fascinating stuff about the way the learning was taking place, and the modules and the way that you were sort of leading teams as they developed. So I think that was, although it was a field hospital type scenario that you were describing, there's got to be some real learning for the normal NHS in that, surely.
Oh yeah, so we've been able to, so obviously James Mountford works at the Royal Free with me, and actually about 2 weeks ago we met the senior staff. I think I've forgotten their names completely, so I do apologise, but the head of the CQC came to visit us to understand our learning module. Yeah. And lucky enough, James has now got a secondment in NHS England, and he's actually taking our learning module and actually trying to get it incorporated into the NHS. So currently, 4 days a week here at Chase Farm, we have a learning forum at 4 o'clock. So obviously we're in COVID times, we're an elective centre, we are a COVID protected site. So we are testing our patients 72 hours before their surgery, they're isolating after that. So there's been lots of planning here and learning, trying to reduce the amount of footfall in outpatients. So some of these sort of learning forums have been about how we can learn exactly about how we're working now to how we want to be working in the future. So lots of sort of QI work involved in that, but it's small sort of QI changes, PDS cycles. You try something once, you keep trying it again until you get it right, and whatever suits the area. So lucky enough, James has been able to bring that learning module into my NHS trust, which it's working. It's very quick. You can make quick changes and you can monitor those changes very quickly. So I think it's fantastic, and I think if NHS England can actually get this out there to other hospitals, I think it's definitely a benefit to all NHS hospitals, even private hospitals. Any way of learning from any incidents that happen during the day or over the course of the week, whether that's infrastructure or whether that's patient care, you can definitely learn from that.
Fantastic, thank you. Tell me a bit then, before we talk about the going forward, because we've got this second wave now building. So how many patients did you have through in the end, and what sort of things were you treating?
So we had 60 patients in total. We never had more than 42 at any one time. Now that wasn't to do with staffing. We had plenty of staff. It was to do with kit. So obviously every hospital was getting ventilators up and down the country. So we could probably have taken up to probably about 84 patients. But but then the kit was getting light, the pumps were getting light. You had to try and have 5 pumps per patient, try and double pump NORAD and stuff like that. So that side of it, we had plenty of nurses coming through. They'd moved the training out to the O2 center, where they'd set up another prefab ward there that looked exactly like how it did inside the Nightingale. So they were able to replicate to the people that were coming for the training how it was actually going to feel when they were on the ward. And I think that made a massive difference. And I think they even tried to continue that for a few weeks after the Nightingale had closed, to try and make sure that we had that base of nursing and that they had sort of upskill ready for the second wave, which is probably imminent in the future. We're obviously looking at maybe peaking in maybe December or even before, depending on how each tier 1, tier 2 or tier 3 lockdown is incorporated into those areas. So yeah, so it's just about how we move forward now.
It's interesting that you had a replica set up. Some years ago, I was asked to go and talk to a group of military ODPs up in York, and they showed me around. They had an exact replica of Camp Bastion in a massive aircraft hangar, and you know, it was certainly impressive. And it did mean that when they were deployed, they were in a familiar environment, really, which was really good.
Yeah.
So were the patients? Obviously patients were being ventilated. How sick were the patients? Did patients die with you, or did most of them?
So out of the 60, it was sad. Yeah, we lost 20 of those patients. It was difficult. Some of the criteria that was set for the Nightingale meant that we couldn't sort of take too many patients with comorbidities. It was generally single organ failure. So due to the limited sort of stuff that we could do inside the XL, it was purely for those sort of single organ failure patients, whether that was heart or lungs, and we were taking those patients. But what subsequently happened about taking those patients is, obviously a lot of them needed dialysis. You were either running the patients dry or running them wet. We obviously didn't know. We were still learning from Italy at that time, so there was constant phone calls, FaceTime meetings with doctors in Italy. They were exchanging treatments and protocols and what worked and what wasn't working for them. So we were constantly, like I was saying with the learning, it was one day it was let's put soda lime in, the other day it was take the soda lime out, it was have higher oxygen levels. It was different ventilator settings. It was so varied in the early stages to make sure that we were getting the best care for those patients based on where they were. We ended up having 6 dialysis bays. We started with 2, but the demand for the dialysis bays just increased tenfold. And some of those patients were having 1 or 2 treatments in a sort of 24-hour period. So it was pretty hectic. A lot of the patients came from BAME backgrounds. I would say there was at least 7 to 8 healthcare workers that we'd actually looked after, which was some of the hardest things. And obviously, even part of the early stages that I sort of missed to mention earlier, but in between sort of being the lead ODP and also becoming a clinical matron, I actually went out and I was part of the retrieval team for LAS. And I was quite lucky that some days they were short on their transfer trainees, or the junior doctors that were scheduled to work with the consultants weren't around. So I was also able to go out and do retrievals and actually go and retrieve patients and actually see the situation inside the hospital. So some of the hospitals were very, they were struggling. I went to Homerton a couple of times. They were struggling. Northwick Park, very high numbers of cases. Oh, there I am there with my LAS crew. So yeah, it was difficult. It was sad, but you just had to make sure that you did the best you can for each and every patient that was in there. Obviously, you might ask about the Nightingales and the future of Nightingales, but part of the reason that we were unable to sort of take step down patients at the Nightingale is we just didn't have the facilities. So there was no showers, there was no windows, there was no toilets. It was hard to, like, we were planning from the beginning. We were planning step down. Like we're gonna once the patients had their tube removed, and we're going to assess them. We're going to give them some CPAP. We're going to move them to the step-down ward. So in the early stages, all that was being planned. But actually, when you got down to it and you actually thought, well, hold on, we're going to take this tube out. We're going to lay this patient in the next bay along as step-down. But actually, he's going to be delirium. There are no windows. They don't know what day and night was. They couldn't speak to any relatives or family. It would have been such a difficult situation to have step down. It would have worked if we had to, but I don't think it was ideal for the number of patients that we had. I was quite lucky that I was the matron for the first patient that was admitted. I was also the matron who discharged the first patient. So it was quite nice actually seeing someone leave, someone actually having a conversation before they left, knowing that they were going to go down to a level 2 HDU bed back in the network, and actually get the right treatment in the right environment for them to recover. I don't think the Nightingale would have been the best place for step down, but like we say, if it was too busy, we would have had to find a way to do that, and to make sure those patients had the best care to recover, really.
Thank you. Talking about going through, I'll just say to the audience, right, that obviously people have been able to put questions on the chat on the side. We'll take those for another couple of minutes, and then Val, whose picture flashed up whilst Matt was rebooting, is going to collate some of those. I have some questions that have been submitted earlier, so in about 10 minutes, 10 minutes or so, we're going to come on to questions. So any final questions, if you can post them for Matt and Val to collate. So we've talked about a lot about the learning, and I think some of the stuff you said there actually resonates with the stuff I was seeing going on around the FaceTime stuff going on with doctors in Italy, those in Europe that were ahead of us in the curve, and the amount of learning. There's an amount of learning still going on, of course, but the amount of learning and sharing that was going on between intensive care units across the world, but certainly across Europe, was phenomenal actually, and that's probably why we're definitely in a better place than we were for the second wave. But tell us, you see the sit rep for ITU, and you've got some idea now, Matt, of what might happen going forward. So tell us a bit about that.
So obviously, a couple of weeks ago we had a conversation, and obviously I obviously can't share the information that I get sent, or my colleagues get sent, but literally a week ago there were 60 ventilated patients in the whole of London. That's increased slightly. I think we're about 85 to 90 at the minute. That could increase, but obviously due to all of those London hospitals, I think Royal Free went from 30 to 60 ITU beds. I think Guy's and Tommy's went from 30 to 70. I think King's converted some of their ITU beds over. And to be honest, I think if it increases as rapidly as they say that happens in a second wave, we may have to go back to the Nightingale. But I think between now and Christmas, we've probably got enough ITU beds in the network, in central London definitely. Outside of London, I think they've all got their own different surge plans. I've got colleagues that work in Watford and Luton, and they've got certain different plans in place. So a lot of the ODPs that I speak to at those hospitals are actually having transfer training. So they're going to get to the point where they're going to need to transfer people out. So I know that Norfolk Park is under a lot of pressure at the minute. Not quite black alert level, but I'm sure that places like Luton, where I've worked before, they've got a good relationship with Adam Brooks, and they've got sort of transfer training in place. Lots of Hamilton ventilators are being purchased to support transfers and ventilating patients in different areas of hospitals. So there's a lot of investment outside of London. I think London has doubled their ITU capacity. How they share that with the North might be the conversations that happen in the network. But from conversations that I've had with obviously my seniors, Natalie and Alan, they don't feel that the Nightingale will be needed. It's actually shrunk by 75%, the Nightingale. So where we had it on both sides of the conference centre, it's now only 500 beds on one side, with all the equipment. So all the equipment for those 500 beds is there, it's prepared. I'm on a 7-day on call. So if they decided to open it, they're going to give me 7 days notice to go down and then restructure it all ready to accept patients. So I don't think we're going to need it just yet, but I like to say never, to be honest. You never know what the pitch is going to be.
I think you're right, because there's a different approach, clearly, and there's a lot of debate about that, isn't there? We see it on the press all the time. But back in March, we were in severe lockdown nationwide, and that certainly had an impact on reducing infection, the R, as everyone calls it, the reproduction rate. They're trying a different approach this time, aren't they, with much more localized lockdowns, and we don't know how that's going to pan out, to be honest. Certainly there's conflicting views, and even some of the scientific experts are saying that it's not really going to hit the spot for what we need. So I think you're right. What was interesting you said there, Matt, was about the ODPs that have been through this. They're actually being used more in their own hospitals now in a different way for ramping up capacity. Do you say any more about that?
Well, I've done a few shifts at Luton. I still sort of keep my clinical hand in. I still go and do agency shifts around London, but Luton mainly is the hospital where I sort of go. It's close to home, and basically they've got, I think it's 27 ITU beds. I could be wrong. I don't want to make any comments on that. But the staff there of, like, before I went to the Nightingale, I was already involved at Luton doing upskill training. So they'd already started doing that with ODPs. ODPs were the first ones that did that upskill training. And then going back post the first wave, and you actually speak to some of those ODPs, and even the nurses. So theatre nurses were then exposed, but didn't have that same upskill training that ODPs had. So ODPs were given that insight. Obviously, they had the insight about ventilators and anaesthetic machines and how we were going to ventilate those patients. But then what was then happening is, during the pandemic, they're then supporting their colleagues from theatres in the theatre nurses, trying to teach them how to understand ventilators. But going forward, I think the transfer training and looking after ITU patients is exactly what every hospital is planning for their ODPs. I don't think there's going to be many ODPs that will be released to go to the Nightingale if you hadn't already worked there before, because I think most NHS hospitals are looking at those assets and actually trying to keep them on site. It was nice actually as well. We had a lot of private hospitals that obviously closed, and we had lots of people that came across from private hospitals that also came and supported us, and they were fantastic. They came maybe not late, but they came after everything had been set up, and it was quite easier for them to come in and understand the process. Whereas people like myself, Jamie, Tim, Gary, we had to sort of sweat out that, is this going to work sort of feeling. Is it going to work for us? Is it going to work in this environment? Whereas when the other ODPs came in, they were sort of aware of what had been gone on, what had been set up. So it seemed a bit more seamless for when they joined.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen a lot through the college, a lot of some frustration, but a lot of ambition from ODPs. Those ODPs that have had a flavour of this now, a flavour of the intensive care, have had their eyes open. And I think the point you made there about nursing colleagues in ITUs have had their eyes opened as well, about the roles that ODPs, things that ODPs can bring to the party. It's going to be, I think, interesting going forward, isn't it? Because clearly our core role is perioperative care, and we will always need a lot of ODAs in perioperative care. Otherwise, patients are not going to get their elective or emergency treatment. But I think it probably has opened up more avenues for ODPs around the country.
Yeah, I've been invited to the King's Fund to do another talk, and what they're focusing on is the recognition of ODPs and the ability to maybe get a job in the ITU in the future. So I know that there's certain different pockets of the NHS that are now exploring how ODPs could actually go and actually work in an ITU setting as an ITU ODP. I think some of these avenues are now being explored because they actually saw the benefit of those staff actually coming to their ITU units and actually being very knowledgeable about ventilation settings, blood gases, all that information that we do every day as part of our job seems seamless next to an ITU nurse. So I think in the future, I think definitely doors, avenues, opportunities to go and work in ITU, if that's the area that you want, I think doors for ODPs will generally open now. Yeah,
It's something
the ODP profession really benefit from that.
Yeah, the college has always promoted, and we use it as a hashtag on Twitter. We've certainly used it since at least 2012 to my knowledge. Is ODPs flexible and adaptable?
Yeah,
and that is our unique selling point as a profession, isn't it?
I think the perioperative bit helps and supports that. Just perioperative, you're multi-skilled already before you're even taken out of your clinical environment and put in somewhere else. You're already adaptable and flexible in that ODP role. So you can only learn more skills and benefit from that.
Yeah, no, perfect. I think we've got about just under 15 minutes to go. So should we move on to questions now? We've had some sent in, and Val, I don't know whether Val's going to email them or she may put a message to me to tell me. We've got some. You've got the questions we've already received. I know you prepared some answers. I'd just like to deal with the second question on there first, which is what do you think the role of the ODP will be in future pandemics? Well, actually, that's you. It's students. What do you think ODP students can be utilised during the pandemic?
Well, I was lucky to work with many student nurses that were in the middle of their training that sort of got halted, so they couldn't continue their training. And those people came, and I think ODP students would have been fantastic. They would have had the knowledge around ventilators. All right, we might not have been necessarily trusting them about changing settings and stuff like that, but they definitely could have been involved. It definitely would have given them an insight into how ITU, another aspect of the role, and if eventually these student ODPs, if that door does open to get a job in ITU, some of these ODPs that would have been there might have actually picked up some very good skills and decided that actually theatres isn't my thing. I want to go and work in ITU. But yeah, ODPs are always going to provide a multi-skilled purpose, whether that is in a transfer, whether you're retrieving, whether you're taking a patient from one hospital to another. Like, the role of the ODP is so broad that during a pandemic we can fit into those little pockets of niche areas where bridging gaps. I haven't got another anaesthetist to go with you in the ambulance. Are you happy to go? It's all these flexible, and I just think ODPs just seamlessly fit into these little pockets. And I think ODP students would have benefited from the whole experience at the Nightingale.
We were talking earlier on, weren't we? And I know from talking to our other colleagues that they've probably forgotten, but the amount of work the educationalists have put in to try and maintain placement for students and the education experience is huge. And I know that a massive amount of work has gone in through that. And we were talking on, should the Nightingales reopen, it's something that you and I can, the college and yourself can liaise on. Is there may be some placement opportunities in future?
Definitely.
And we can sort of help broker that if that were to come about. The other thing, and other people have said, there's a lot of work going on PEEP, isn't it? The peer enhanced placements that have been developed as well nationally. So there's an opportunity there as well. I think you probably more or less covered it, but the role of the ODP in future pandemics. Do you want to say any more about that, or do you think you've covered it off?
I think I've said enough. So I think that, to be honest, I would like to thank every ODP that stepped out in the pandemic, whether that means that you'd retired, you'd given up, and you saw the call for us to come and get back into practice. I can just say thank you to all those ODPs that came back. Whether you're ex-military or you've retired, you still had that desire to get involved. And I think that'll be the same. I think there's even one of the questions on here that said, look, he's ex-military, he'd been out of practice for 20 months, and he's asking, could he be of any use? Now, those are the people that we want. They're the people that we want to come out. Like, you haven't lost your skills in 20 months. To be an ODP, a core ODP, you know exactly your area. And I definitely think anyone that's sitting at home thinking, I've retired, there is still a role for you if you need it in this second wave, and definitely to come and explore. unless you've got health conditions,
Yeah.
I would definitely consider coming out of retirement and getting involved if it's something that you're up for. Definitely.
I think that's important, and even people who've been out of practice for longer than 20 months. One of the great advantages now we're part of the Allied Health Professionals family is the return to practice. There's a lot of incentive and development going on for encouraging AHPs to return to practice. So if you are an ODP who is looking to return to practice, even after many years, some of them do follow that through. You can contact the college for information, but certainly Health Education England's got stuff on their website. But yeah, that is a really good point, Matt. That these people are going to be needed going forward. In terms of future roles,
you could never have enough ODPs. You could never, not in a pandemic. You could never have enough ODPs.
Yeah. Interestingly, one of the things that has just recently happened is the government has been consulting on expanding the groups of people who can participate in mass vaccination, which is interesting. And so the college did respond to that, as you might imagine. And there's two things going on. One, there is the PGDs, which everyone knows that that's a long-held ambition. Unfortunately, that's now in public consultation. If you go on to the media, you can see that. Make sure you respond. Why only should be included. But interestingly enough, most existing mass vaccination programs, and if you talk about the seasonal flu pandemic, doesn't take place under a PGD. It takes place under occupational health schemes, which is a particular part of the human medicine regulations.
Yeah.
And that is hugely restrictive because it actually says that it has to be nurses, registered nurses, working in a certain way to the way the directions are written. But it's a specific part of the Act. And we, of course, said, you've got 14,500 registered ODPs. There's a lot of potential there to be unleashed. And if you just can't use them for peer vaccination in something as simple as the flu pandemic, for flu vaccinations, what can you do? So you need to absolutely be looking at changing those regulations as well. I think there's going to be a lot more awareness in government and other parts about actually say there's 14,500 people out there and we haven't even begun to tap into their potential yet. And we need to be looking at all the things that will enable that. So that I think that's a really important thing. There's some questions on here about things about just sort of how was your shift patterns there?
So the shift patterns were obviously 12-hour shifts. Us as matrons, we all did the same shifts as the nurses. So I generally worked with the similar group of nurses on every shift for about 6 weeks. So I did 2 long days and then 2 night shifts. And that was a sort of pattern that everyone did. So whether you were a doctor or everyone did sort of 2 long days, 2 nights, and that just sort of rolled over each week. So it would move a day along. So 1 week I was doing Monday, Tuesday, then the nights. I'd have a couple of days off. Then I'm starting Tuesday, Wednesday days. So it was varied. Like Easter was a glitch. We didn't see Easter. We didn't see any bank holidays because it was just shift. The only time we've sort of realised it was Easter is when someone dropped a few Easter eggs off for us. But apart from that, it was literally it was so tunnel vision that you were just in that 4-shift pattern the whole time.
Interesting thought, because there's been debate about this, not associated with COVID. But do you think 12-hour shifts are really a sensible way forward with this? And certainly if you're wearing full PPE.
Like I'd say in hospitals it might be a bit different, but like in the conference centre, in the Excel, we did all the training beforehand about sign language and how you could increase the dose, lower it, turn it, all hand signals to try and are you okay, all those types of things. Whereas in the Nightingale, we didn't have to worry about that. The room was so big that the noise went up. So it was very different to how to communicate inside that ward. But yeah, it's yeah. Sorry.
Been tough. We've got a few more questions have come in. Val's emailed me. I mean, one of them was answered. Anna, hello Anna, is a student ODP saying, can I, she attended the med zone training at the O2, and I was wondering if the hospital reopens, would I be able to come and help as a student? Well, I think we've answered that. Is that we'll talk if that were to happen, we'll talk about how we can try and offer placements to students if that comes about. So that's the answers, Anna. A very specific question here, Matt. Did you have any patients with COVID in the feet? I know that's a thing, isn't it? People who've had rashes on their feet as a symptom.
To be honest, we weren't really looking at the feet, to be honest.
Sure. Yeah. And then this one, and this, I'm not sure who said this, but it's exactly what was going through my mind, was this needs to be written up, doesn't it, really? In that the experience of this, not just from learning from experience, and what we've learned this evening from you, Matt, has been so rich and amazing. But it's actually, we've got to do this again in 10 years' time. The lessons learned. Do you know if that's being led nationally?
What's that? Sorry, what's being led nationally?
Someone's going to write up, this is what we did to set up this Nightingale Hospital, or these Nightingale Hospitals. This is what went well. This is what we've learned from it. And the next time we're faced with this is how we'll do it differently.
I definitely think the learning module that we were using there, and James Mountford going to NHS England, I definitely think that the NHS is now focusing on how they could deal with pandemics better in the future. I think obviously XL in London was for ventilated patients. Some of the other 6 Nightingales up north, whether that was Newcastle and the other areas, they've been set up slightly different. So some of them do have toilets, showers, windows. So there are other avenues for, I think the XL is separate to the others. None of the others took any ventilated patients. There were more step down units to relieve the pressure in the hospitals. And I think they're definitely there to work. They're not going to be dismantled yet. They're there, whether that means we use them as step downs, whether we open them as endoscopy suites to help the backlog of the cancer pathways for endoscopy. I think the NHS is actually planning a much better strategy around COVID-19 and how we tackle it until that vaccine comes out. And who's to say that first vaccine is actually going to work? We've obviously got, I work for the Royal Free, and obviously in the news yesterday on the BBC, they've got a project called Challenge COVID, which is basically injecting patients with certain doses leading up to, they're trying to find the exact dose where you contract it. And they're also then going to give those patients the vaccine and then give it to them again. Like this is the art of science, and this is where we're going to get our answers and our results. It's these kind of volunteers that step forward for their country basically and the world, and actually be given COVID and then how it's treated and from the early stages. So I definitely think the NHS is definitely looking at how strategy could be done. The other thing is that Royal Free here would give him the Ebola drug, is it Ricivavan?
Yeah.
And that was quite good in the early stages, and I think they had some success with it, and then using some NIV rather than intubation. So I definitely think hospitals are definitely going down the CPAP NIV route rather than the first port of call is put a tube in. So I think definitely the strategy from the doctors and the NHS nationally is totally different from when we first had that first pandemic, that first wave.
Thank you. I was going to thank you in a moment and make some closing remarks because we're almost up at 8 o'clock. For Val, who's listening, Val, can you just email me the Teams invite again, please? She'll understand that. Matt, I just want to say on behalf of us all and everyone that's listening, thank you so much for sharing this evening. It has been a hugely rich experience, and I think there's a whole lot of messaging for ODPs for our profession, but it is around that flexible and adaptable and being willing to get stuck in. And you know, you're a great exemplar of that for our profession. So thank you so much. We're going into a different phase now as closing remarks. the clapping seems a long time ago, doesn't it? Clapping for the NHS. We're all seeing now a frustration with those people who are waiting for more elective care, or even cancer treatments. And there is some pushback against the NHS now from, you know, the public is becoming weary, I think, of this. We can't be weary of it, and what's really important for everyone involved in healthcare at the moment is look after yourself, and that's not just your physical health and looking after exactly your mental health is so important. There's lots of stuff online and resources available. Use your colleagues, you know, peer support, looking after each other is so important. So really, this pandemic isn't over by any stretch of the imagination. Things are going to be very different going forward because of the work that people like Matt and colleagues have done and the learning that has come out of that. So it will be different going forward, but it doesn't mean it's not going to be hard for everyone. So leaving you with those thoughts, once again, Matt, thank you for a fantastic evening. I hope everyone who's been on really has enjoyed it, and once we publicise it, lots of people I'm sure will pick up the recording. So Matt, thank you very much.
No, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for inviting me, Bill. I'm more than happy to help again in the future. So, and thanks for everyone for coming to actually watch and listen to what me and Bill have had to talk about. So, no, thank you out there, and good luck to all the ODPs in the future.
Thank you. Absolutely. So, good night, everyone. Thanks very much. We'll end. Thank you.